Okay, so today I wanted to talk about Yitzchak and Rivka separately, and then a little bit about their marriage together. And I think it's one of the, I think that the story of the marriage of Yitzchak and Rivka is, for me, one of the more difficult stories to comprehend. And I think that Yitzchak as a character is one of the more enigmatic characters that there are certainly in Breshit. I can't say in Tanakh, but certainly in Breshit, and certainly of the Avot, he really is the most enigmatic. We talked last week about Avraham. This has no connection to last week at all, but Avraham's midah, Avraham's characteristic, was the characteristic of chesed. So what is Yitzchak's characteristic? What would you say? Okay, so Yitzchak's known, his characteristic is gevura, which we translate as strength,
discipline, structure.
Okay, good. So I think that we need to really define this word because I'd like to evaluate Yitzchak's personality as it appears in the following sources, or as it appears in the Torah, and discuss where the gevura, how his personality fits gevura. So what I think maybe what we'll start with is just, I Xeroxed on the stapled booklet in front of you, all of the stories of Yitzchak that appear in the Torah. And if you just want to glance through them, they're all familiar to you probably. And if you just want to glance through them, they each have the main theme of it on the top, and then the Hebrew text and the English text. And tell me if you see a common denominator between the stories, or between, let's say, most of the stories, maybe with the exception of number 5, I would say. But between the other 5 stories, and there are 6 altogether, what is, let's say, the common denominator between most of those stories?
Well, one thing
Yeah.
I'm just looking and never noticed, you don't really hear him speaking.
Very good. Very good. I want to highlight that.
Well, he did speak up in story 1, verse 7.
In story 2, right?
Story 2.
Right, okay. So verse 7, good. Good. Hold that point for a moment. So we don't really see him speaking. We're going to see in a moment what he says.
Following in his father's footsteps, or his mother's footsteps, a lot of that.
Right. I think so.
Well, I mean, it just,
Maybe.
I don't know yet, but if you look at verses 66 and 67, right?
This is number 3? Yeah.
It always struck me as a little strange
That what?
that he would take his wife into his mother's tent. It just was my gut reaction.
Okay.
Why'd he do that? It almost reminded me of what Reuben does later on with Bilhah. I know it's not the same, not at all,
Right.
not at all. Right, but I think there was a lot of emotion attached to it, and because why his mother's tent?
Good
I
question.
don't know,
It was
that's just what,
available.
right, I know,
question.
but
Well,
I'm
probably
telling you, emotionally, it just struck a chord.
Right, I think there may be some significance to that.
Okay. It was just my reaction.
Any other? Let's evaluate some of the stories. We have the first story, Yitzchak is born, so there's nothing, it's a very brief story. He's born, Abraham gives him a Brit Milah, he's a baby. The story that follows that, which I didn't copy, is just a brief mention of him in the story of Gerush Hagar v'Yishmael, when Sarah says that because she didn't like the way Yishmael was around Yitzchak, so she therefore asked Abraham to send away Hagar and Yishmael. I didn't put that story in because it doesn't really, again, except for the mention of Yitzchak as being the main reason for this, for sending them away, it's not really a story about Yitzchak.
But it's another case where all the other brothers interact with their brothers. And this is the only time.
Ah, that's interesting. He doesn't interact.
point.
Good point. Very good point. Right? Even Esav and Yaakov, and they don't, right?
Right.
So very good. It's a good point. That fits in, I think, very nicely. So we have, yeah.
But somebody is affecting him, right? Somebody's doing something to him.
Right.
Right. So that's what I want to highlight. Okay, take a look at all of the stories with the exception of, let's say, number 5. Okay, so we have he's born, everyone has to be born, and that's done to you. Akedat Yitzchak, which is the main story about him, or maybe one of the main stories about him, he's completely passive, right? And he goes along with Abraham. The one thing that I think is active, about him is that he goes willingly, as Chazal say that he knew at a certain point what was happening, and he goes along willingly. But he really is just a pawn in that story. Abraham is being told what to do, and Yitzchak is being done too. Even if you see, I just was in my machzor, I was using a machzor that had Mechon HaMikdash machzor, and it had pictures in it of different parts of davening Rosh Hashanah, and the picture of the Akedah struck me because it was an old Abraham holding a grown Yitzchak in his arms, and and it just the way it was drawn there looked different to me than other pictures where it looked more. Here it really looked like this grown man, but that was Yitzchak. Abraham acted upon him. Our next story, number 3, the marriage of Yitzchak. So I only put in the last few psukim of that story, but the whole earlier part of the story is about Abraham's servant and Rivka, and the whole story is about how Abraham sends his servant to get a wife for Yitzchak. Yitzchak is not involved at all. And Eliezer returns with this wife that he has, or Hashem has helped him choose. And then at the end of the story, Yitzchak is in the field, and Rivka sees him. And then she understands that this is going to be the man she's supposed to marry. And then Yitzchak, here he's a little bit active. He brings her into his mother's tent. That's an interesting point that you mentioned. And then she became, he marries her, she became his wife. Next story, the birth of Yaakov and Esav. So again, there he's a little bit active. His wife has a baby. He davens for her to have a child. It's not a significant piece of information about him. Let's skip 5 for a moment. And then the last story, which is the bracha that he gives to Yaakov and Esav. So what's that story? Right? There again, what's his involvement? His involvement is saying, Esav, I want you to go get me food so I can give you a bracha. What's the rest of the story? That's all of the things that happen to him. That's Rivka's whole manipulation, let's call it, and how she moves things to happen such that Yaakov receives the bracha, and Yaakov's deceit, and how Yitzchak is acted upon, he is deceived, and then he gives the bracha, and to the wrong person. So the whole story, even though he's actively doing something, the whole story happens almost to him, because he's not aware of everything happening in the story, and he's almost like the passive one. Everyone else is really creating that story to match how they want it to happen. So it seems that Yitzchak is a very passive personality. Now I want to get back to what you both said earlier. You said that we don't see him talking very much at all, and you mentioned that the first thing that we see is in the Akedah. Now let's just take a look for a moment, okay, there's one, I underlined 2 psukim, they're in segment 4. And the first pasuk says, "Ve'ela toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham." These are the generations of Yitzchak, the son of Avraham. Avraham holid et Yitzchak. Avraham sired Yitzchak. So, just this pasuk itself, there's so many questions you can ask on it. it's just repetitive. We only need one half of it. We don't need both halves. Either Avraham holida Yitzchak, or, these are the generations of Yitzchak ben Avraham. So what is happening in this pasuk that it's really repeating this very short statement twice?
Isn't there a medrash that says that people were saying Abraham was too old, so he couldn't have possibly given birth to Yitzchak, so this is
Good,
to
good.
emphasize that.
Perfect, excellent. So that's actually, if you take a look at the single sheet that I have, that's actually what Rashi says in that first source. That basically, this happened after Avimelech had taken Sarah, and then basically there was a whole, like you mentioned, Chazal, Josh, the people were teasing Sarah and saying, you never had any children with Abraham. Maybe Abraham's not really the father. All of a sudden, after you're with Avimelech, you have a child. And so therefore, the Rashi says that Yitzchak's, the end of the second line, Tsar Klaster Panav Shel Yitzchak Domela Avraham, that his face was very, very similar to Avraham, so it was clear, or had to be clear to everybody, that he was Avraham's child and no other alternative. And so that's why, according to Rashi, the pasuk repeats and says, these are the generations of Yitzchak, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the one who sired Yitzchak. That's Rashi. But there's another way of looking at it, and I think it's Beno Yaakov who says, what's the very center of that? Or what begins and ends the pasuk? It's like a little bit of a chiastic structure there. It starts with Yitzchak, and then it moves to Abraham, and then it, again to Abraham, and then it ends with Yitzchak. So Yitzchak is framing the story, but who's the center of the story?
Abraham.
Okay, Abraham. Everything in Yitzchak's life, or much of Yitzchak's life, really revolves around Abraham. And that's where we come to the pasuk that you mentioned. The very first words that we hear Yitzchak speak at all are what?
Verse 7.
Which is what? What does he say?
My father.
Exactly. The very first thing that we hear Yitzchak say is Avi, as he's being taken to the Akedah, and he says, my father. So it's pretty clear through much of the little hints, but also through what we're going to see a little bit more, that Yitzchak is really his father's son. He's very much his father's son. Now we said that his characteristic is gevura, but what we just saw was passivity. It's not gevura, it's passivity. I want to take a look now at source 5. Okay, what's this story? Yitzchak is more active. But what's this story about? There's two parts of this story.
Is that when he's playing with his wife?
Correct. Okay, so that's the first part. And then the second part begins, let's say, about verse 17. Okay, in the first story in this segment, so Yitzchak is playing with his wife, and Avimelech sees, this is after Avimelech wants to take Rivka, and Yitzchak has said that basically, she's not his wife, and then Avimelech sees them acting like husband and wife, and realizes that he was tricked, and gets very upset. What does this remind us of? Right, Abraham. Okay, what's the second part? What does it say in verse 17? What's the second part of this Avimelech story? Okay, and Yitzchak departed from Avimelech, asked him to leave. Yitzchak left, and he encamped in the valley of Gerar, and he lived there. Okay, Yud Chet, 18, and Yitzchak digged again the wells of water, which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father. Okay, because the Plishtim had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. And the rest of the story is about Yitzchak and the wells that he reopened, Abraham's wells that he reopened. So this one perek here is a more active perek. Yitzchak is the person who's doing most of the action, but what kind of action is it?
He doesn't take initiative, he's following what his father did.
Exactly. So Yitzchak essentially is a passive character, and when he's acting, he's really walking exactly in his father's footsteps and doing exactly the same things that his father did. And essentially, his personality is not a very clear personality. He's almost like this echo of his father. And exactly like the pasuk says, Ele todot Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avraham holid et Yitzchak. Yitzchak is his father's son, and then Yitzchak becomes his son's father. So, Yaakov's father. So Yitzchak himself seems to have this very unclear, just nondescript personality. And so the question that I want to ask, first of all, is where is the gevura in that? Okay, that's really, to me, that seems like one of the biggest, we say that he's a gibor, we say that that's gevura, and then you look at the stories and they just don't bear it out. So where is the gevura in that? That's question number one.
Unless there's
Yeah.
something in 22. Because I don't see how 22, the well there was related to the other well. Does this look like it was his initiative? I mean, it's not clear. It just,
Yeah, it is. It seems to be that, a well that he may have dug.
So that might show some of his own initiative in that point?
It's his own initiative, but again,
Maybe.
he's really following, I mean,
Right.
he's still doing the same thing that his father did.
Right.
It starts with his
Okay.
father's wells and it continues with, a couple of new wells maybe. Okay. So, yes,
Maybe gevura is not necessarily, is being able to subjugate yourself to someone else who has, I don't want to say more experience, but who is a leader.
Nice, right? So I think that really, I think that for me defines Yitzchak's gevura. That and the Akedah, really, where he did the same thing, essentially. He's subjugating himself to what somebody else who has a mission has to do. And I think that's what Yitzchak's gevura is. It's not strength of personality as it goes forth, it's rather strength of personality as it holds back. What was Yitzchak's role in life? So Avraham was clearly, Avraham was the powerhouse. Avraham went ahead, he left his father, he left his homeland, he went to this new country, he starts monotheism, he brings other people to recognize monotheism. Hashem promises Avraham and gives him the two brachot, one of many children and one of Eretz Yisrael. Avraham is the powerhouse. What's Yitzchak's role? Continuity. I once saw, sometimes a person's role or a person's greatness is not necessarily what we would expect. I once was watching something about George Washington, and it said that George Washington's perhaps biggest contribution was not necessarily in his contribution of being the first president of the United States. It was really in allowing there to be a second president of the United States. In, coming from this monarchy where you just do it until you die, the fact that George Washington said, this is all, I did it for a term, I'm giving it up, and somebody else has to take over. So that was his greatness, and because that was so different than anything else. So that's what Yitzchak has to do. That's Yitzchak's role. It's not being the active one, it's being the successor. And being a successor is a very, very hard role, because following along in someone's footsteps, whether it's a sibling or whether it's a parent, being the successor to a very, very successful and influential person is difficult, because who are you? How do you measure up to that person? And on the one hand, it often leads to feelings of inadequacy because you're not that person. On the other hand, the role of successor is so important, because a person who puts something into action, a revolutionary, has to make all the changes. But they mean nothing if they don't continue. It's the second generation that has to be the stability, that has to take those changes and just live with them and perpetuate them quietly. That allows the revolutionary to have accomplished his goal. So in order for Yitzchak to make a name for himself, he has to perpetuate what Avraham did. Avraham made all the changes. Yitzchak has to just live them. Hashem gave Avraham the bracha of multiplying his seed and of inheriting Eretz Yisrael. And so key stories in Yitzchak's life are the fact that he is going to be the person who takes over after Avraham. So this whole long story about finding the appropriate wife for Yitzchak, And then the whole story about his sons and who gets the bracha and who carries on Abraham's legacy. That's a key piece of who Yitzchak is, because he has to, that's Hashem's bracha, and if Hashem promised it to Abraham, it has to happen. And then the part about Eretz Yisrael, Yitzchak, as opposed to Abraham, who travels all over. Abraham is a herdsman. He travels all over the place. He has a lot of cattle and sheep, and he goes from Eretz Yisrael, well, from Haran to Eretz Yisrael, from Eretz Yisrael to Mitzrayim, back to Eretz Yisrael, to Gerar, and back to Eretz Yisrael. So he's all over. Yitzchak is really supposed to stay put, and he does go to Gerar, but he's not supposed to leave Eretz Yisrael, and he's not supposed to go down to Mitzrayim, because Hashem promised Abraham, Eretz Yisrael is yours, and Yitzchak has to be the person to just live that, and to be living in Eretz Yisrael, and not making these major changes. So Yitzchak is the tent dweller. He's the one who tries to remain in one place. He's the passive one who is the successor to his father, and he almost has to rein in any initiative that he might take so that he can just be the stabilizer, so that his father's mission will have permanence. And so I think that's Yitzchak's gevura. Now, when we see the brachot, when Yitzchak has to choose a successor, so he has two sons. One son is Esav, and Esav's profession is the Yodei Tzayid. He is like the hunter, the active one, and Yaakov is Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim. He's the tent dweller. He is the quiet one. And who does Yitzchak prefer?
Esau.
Okay, he prefers the active son. He sees one son who's like his father. He's active. He takes initiative. He perhaps doesn't see, the Mefarshim disagree whether he is aware of Esav's true personality or not, but whatever it is, he chooses the active son over the passive son, and he feels that he had to suppress his personality, but it's his active son who needs to take over and lead us, into the next generation and continue on the legacy. And Rivka sees otherwise, and she manipulates things so that Yaakov gets the bracha instead. And Yitzchak is shaken by when he realizes that he was deceived. Except, he does say, when Esav comes to Yitzchak and says, "Please give me a bracha," so Yitzchak's response to Esav is, "I gave it to Yaakov," and I'm looking in number 6, pasuk Lamed Gimel, or verse 33. So Vayacharad Yitzchak charada gedola ad ma'od. Yitzchak trembled, this great trembling. And Vayomer, who is this person who brought me the food? Va'avarcheu, and I blessed him. And then he says, Gam baruch yehiyeh. Indeed, he will be blessed. It's when he realizes that it was Yaakov, and he realizes that he did bless him, so he is going to be blessed. But it's more than that. It's Yitzchak acknowledging that, you know what? Yaakov has it in him. Okay? He sees that when Yaakov, that quiet tent dweller, who seemed to be very, very passive, when Yaakov wants something, or when he's told, he can go ahead and he can get it by whatever means it might take. And the fact that he deceived, I remember once, and I hope the students don't remember to hear this too loudly, as a student, I was a very quiet student, always wanted to do whatever the teacher said, never caused any trouble at all, until one day, this little trick, the rattlesnake eggs trick, where you take a button and you have a paper clip and you twist up the rubber band, and then you put this little contraption into an envelope, and you say to somebody, I have these rattlesnake eggs, you want to see them, but careful, I hope they didn't hatch. And then they open it, and as they open it, it creates a little space for the button to twirl around on the rubber band, and it makes a lot of noise rattling against the envelope, and it's very startling if you just heard that it's rattlesnake eggs. So I was a very quiet student, and for some reason I went over and I gave it to a teacher. And I did the trick on a teacher of mine, which that probably wasn't so appropriate. But the teacher's reaction at parent-teacher conferences when she said to my parents, she said, I was so glad to see that she had some personality. So that's what Yitzchak is saying, and I'm not Yaakov, but that's what Yitzchak is saying here. I was worried about Yaakov, and I didn't want to give him the bracha because I didn't think that he had the initiative to be able to take it to the next generation. But now that I see what he did, Gam Baruch Yehiyeh, he does, and he certainly will be blessed, and he certainly can carry on that lineage. And so Yitzchak's greatness, I think, is in seeing what need there was at his time and being able to suppress his personality. His gevura was just being the successor, saying, I am going to be the one who's stable. I'm not going to assert myself in any other way. And seeing that in the need for his father, and just being the child of the father and the father of his child. That's Yitzchak.
There's also the word lehitgaber, and that's what,
Nice,
to
good.
overcome.
That's good.
And using the same roots, and that
Right.
seems to be also what Yitzhak, and he's
Exactly.
kind of overcome being his father's son, you know.
He is overcome.
Yeah,
Interesting, right, okay. right.
so he kind of, that's, you know, kind of a gevura, you know, that you
Yes.
kind of.
Yes, very nice.
In Pasuk Lamed Gimel, when it says V'yacharad Yitzchak Haradag Gdola Ad Ma'od, it's the first time you're seeing Yitzchak showing emotion also.
Very good. Very
You don't
good.
see it in Akedat Yitzchak at all.
You don't see it at all, correct. The question is where he gets married, he loves, so that's,
Right,
but yeah,
right.
that's,
But that was
Emotion,
even
but
after
that's-
he got married. Then it
Correct.
says V'yacharad
Correct.
versus, like, okay, you
Correct.
did a shidduch, I wasn't even interested, and now I fell in love.
right, correct, good point. And this is really more of more of a strong expression of emotion here, where he, right, very good point.
And you're also giving Yaakov credit for just following in his mother's
Correct.
recommendation.
Correct, that's true, he was doing what he was told. Although he was doing what he was told, Yitzchak didn't necessarily know that, okay? He may not have been aware that this is exactly what he only knew that Yaakov deceived him. So at the moment that this happens, he doesn't necessarily know that Yaakov was not going to take the initiative. You're right, maybe Yaakov was more docile than Yitzchak thought. But he doesn't know that at this point. Okay, so that's Yitzchak. What I also want to talk about is Rivka. And the other difficulty that I have with this whole Yitzchak and Rivka story is that as a couple, I find them to be one of the more difficult couples to understand their relationship. Because it seems, Abraham and Sarah, we don't really, see so much of a relationship, but we see them, they're harmonious. Yitzchak and Rivka, the one thing that we're really left with is the fact that she deceives him, and it's a huge, it's a huge deceit. It changes the course of what he intends to be, the history of his progeny. And it's a very difficult thing to understand, A, her personality, and B, their marriage, in terms of, was he a tragic figure that, did they not have a good relationship? Did they have a good relationship? So I want to explore that a little bit through exploring Rivka's personality also. I do not zero out the